So I guess we can start the session now that we know that there is remote participation. And let me say welcome to the remote participants first, and let me welcome all of you to this workshop. My name is Thomas Rickert. I'm representing ECO, an Internet Industry Association in Germany with more than 900 members from more than 60 countries. And I've been invited to moderate this joint workshop hosted by EuroISPA and CENTA, so that we can all better understand the technical functionalities of the internet, because there's so much talk about content regulation, what can't be done, should not be done by the various technical providers when it comes to enforcing or implementing, operationalizing laws or restrictions there are when it comes to delivering content. And some of these side effects are undesired. Some are desired, at least for some. And that's quite a controversial debate for 20 years or so. Since the internet started, people have been talking about how to limit the accessibility of content to contents or services that are desired by certain parties. But what's even longer in place is fundamental misunderstandings about how all this works, what the limitations for those attempts are, and what should not be done. And therefore, I think it's very applaudable that EuroISPA and CENTA have decided to offer a workshop where you all, including the remote participants, get first-hand information about how the DNS, the domain name system, works and what the role of the different players are and where interception or content regulation can be done technically. So basically what we're going to do in this afternoon is have a discussion that is structured in a way that might be a little bit unfamiliar for all of you, including myself. First, we're going to hear Peter von Roster talking about the technical side of things. So he's going to talk on behalf of CENTA. We had Malcolm Huddy speaking on behalf of EuroISPA, but he can't be with us, unfortunately. Should he be with us remotely? Hello, Malcolm. So we're going to hear about the technical basics first. Then I will give all of you the opportunity to ask technical questions in case you didn't understand properly what Peter was talking about. And after that, we're going to have fire starters. And I'm using 2 cultural references in my introduction. Maybe you find out what they are. So 2 cultural references, and you can raise your hand or raise them remotely if you find out who they are. So we're going to have fire starters. They may not have been prodigies, but they're going to make initial statements to spark off a discussion. He's not going to be one of the fire starters, so he can safely sing, "We didn't start the fire," but maybe some of you will put themselves into the queue and add their own views to the discussion. So first Peter, then we're going to hear some fire starters making statements, and after that we're going to invite all of you, including the remote participants. You can write something in the chat and we'll make sure that it's been conveyed to all of you so that we can have a discussion. And the idea is that we don't have that as a Q&A with the panelists or with the fire starters. So that's not the idea. But the idea is that you put forward your own ideas, suggestions, thoughts, so that we can hopefully all evolve some thoughts on this very important subject. And now, without any further ado, I would like to hand over to Peter.
Thank you, Thomas. So yes, I won't start a fire, but still I hope to bring some light. My name is Peter van Rosten. I'm the General Manager of CENTA. And I'm a lawyer, so rather than having a tech person explain this, they are so enthusiastic about this topic that they typically wouldn't get much further than the first 10 slides of this deck. So they asked me, and I'm very happy to oblige. Practical things, questions at the end, please. We're going to have a very fast ride through the next 30 minutes from the plug in the wall to how the internet works, the role of IANA, the role of the different players. So in order to keep track of the timing somehow, we're going to take and allow 10-15 minutes of questions at the end. If you have questions later, always feel free to reach out to me or to my colleague Nina Elser, who's standing there. So, who is talking to you? I'm here on behalf of Centre. We are the organization for exchange, dialogue, and innovation of country code domains registries in Europe. So we're the CCTLDs. .eu is a member, .uk, .nl, .de. We have all the European countries plus a few more. The dialogue part is what we're doing now. We're engaging with conversations with European stakeholders, policymakers, and we're providing training and education. We do plenty of things for our members. Some of these are relevant for you as well. We have reports on ICANN and IETF meetings and RIPE meetings. They are neutral reports on things that are happening there. And they're open for everyone, so they're public access on our website. They have 500, 600, 700 readers, and I hope you might find them useful. So what are we going to cover? What the internet looks like, what IP addresses are, how they connect and talk to each other, how networks work, including internet exchanges, why we need a DNS and how it works, a bit about the root, who does what in the technical layers on the internet, and what blocking is and why it doesn't work. If I'm talking about layers, then have a look at the graphic that we put on your table. It is one representation. Look at other representations and you'll see minor differences and interpretations. The idea is that by the end of the session, at least for the technical layers, you would have a pretty good idea of who each of those stakeholders is, and what their role is, and how important they are to the internet ecosystem. So, surprisingly, the internet is built with carrots. It's a very important principle. The internet is not built with sticks. All the protocols, most of the technical details that I'm going to share with you, are agreed within fora such as the IETF and IAB. And people use them because they work. People use them because it helps their networks connect to networks and billions of other internet users. There have been examples where people didn't think the carrot was interesting and they did their own thing. A large Italian ISP, end of the 90s, built their own route. So you could use different addresses. You could go to .hotel and .golf, end of the 90s. It didn't work because the people that had their websites on a .hotel or a .golf wanted foreign users to get access to that content as well. So, very important principle. There are almost no obligatory standards, and everybody who's interested in doing something different is completely free to do so. Everybody knows these boxes in their offices. They connect your local network. Typically, you'll see some device in there, which can be a router, a firewall. The Wi-Fi box will be attached to this box. From there, if you're on one of the upper floors in parallel with the elevator shafts, the cables go to the street. They typically will connect in suspiciously looking gray boxes on the corner of your street, and then from there it goes to larger boxes somewhere in the center of the quarter where you're living. These cables and these network points get connected by cables in between cities. Railroads were one of the early adopters of networking, of building the networks, because they realized they had a very precious asset. That is, they have an almost straight line between two major cities. Telecom providers, ISPs, have been crucial in providing the investment to put the copper, the fiber in the ground, and more these days to make sure the 3G, 4G, 5G networks work. There's satellite connectivity. There is obviously transatlantic cables that provide connectivity between the continents. At the moment, between Europe and the US, about 24 large are operated, typically run by telecom companies and ISPs, but you see that this starts to change. Last week, Google and Facebook announced that in cooperation with a Telefonica affiliate, they are going to operate a cable connecting Europe, Bilbao, to Washington, D.C. In case, because this is a question I often get during these trainings, cables are put into the ocean bed by plowing a ditch and then putting the cable in and then covering the ditch. So they're not just resting typically on the sea floor. So what do these cables do? They connect devices. Every single device, whether it's wireless or whether it's through the Ethernet cable that you plug in into your computer or laptop in the office. And they connect these devices with data centers, huge data centers. The cables are split when they enter those rooms, and they're connected to racks, and in those racks you'll find huge data storage facilities. More and more, these data centers are ready-made. Plug-and-play shipping containers that literally require a big power supply to make sure that the cooling works, and a couple of cables from different operators to make sure there's redundancy and connectivity. But this is how they're shipped, and they are so redundant that even if 50% of the material, the equipment in there, stops working, it's still good to go for another couple of months. They are hardly opened. They are ready-made, and the expectation is that these containers will get smaller and smaller and smaller. And to paraphrase Bill Gates, that in a few years from now, everybody will have one of these data centers sitting on every desk in every home. So we have devices, we have data centers, we have the physical network, whether it's wireless and waves or whether it's copper and cable and fiber. The equipment on the network needs to be able to identify each other. And in order to do that, they need a unique identifier. And through standards set by the IETF and IAB decades ago, we're using IP addresses. IP addresses are unique identifiers. On your own network, you might see that the identifiers at the moment used in your networks are unique, but you will find the same IP addresses used on your laptop at home, for instance. But the moment you get on the internet, the moment it's connected to the rest of the world, these identifiers have to be unique to work. So you can imagine that with all those devices, laptops, mobile phones, data warehouses, you need billions of IP addresses. So how are these managed? Who keeps track of what is where? That is the role of IANA, the Internet Authority for Assigned Names, Numbers. The IANA function splits the existing amount of IPv4 addresses, I'll come to IPv6 in a minute, and hands them out to the different regions. For Europe, it's RIPE, Réseau IP Européen, who's managing this block for Europe. And RIPE then splits up the large block they get for Europe and hands it out to ISPs, to research institutions, to governments, to large companies, to allow them to connect their devices to the web and also to do R&D. Importantly, and this comes back in particular in the privacy discussions, there are two types of IP addresses. There are the static ones, typically servers connected to the net, data centers, information that needs to be always on. And there are dynamic addresses, typically handed out to consumers for the very simple reason to optimize the use of the limited block of IP addresses that everybody gets assigned. On IPv4, there's a shortage these days, as I'll explain in a minute. So that means that if you check your IP address every week, you'll probably see that you're getting assigned a different IP address every time. That has a significant implication for whether it's considered to be personal data or not, until a week ago. Some of the policy debates are directly affecting this technical explanation that I'm sharing with you now on the web, because these addresses, as long as they were not considered to be personal data, could be used by everyone to monitor the networks, to control the networks, to track behavior of users in case of criminal activity. But the Advocate General of the European Court of Justice last week wrote in his opinion that because of the ever-increasing use of big data sets, also dynamic addresses would be considered to be personal data. So 2 different IP addresses, static and dynamic. Difference between IPv4 and IPv6. This type of address is probably quite familiar to all of you. These you see more and more. Uptake in Europe, I learned yesterday from a presentation by RIPE, is quite good. It's better than in the rest of the world. Benefits of IPv4, it's compatible with all equipment, also with equipment that is still there sitting in a cupboard from 10 years ago. Your Wi-Fi router at home might be one example. The advantage of IPv6 in particular is there are many more. IPv4 is running out. RIPE is still holding on to the few last million IPv4 addresses to make sure that they're still being used to those who most need it to start up a business or to do some particular bit of research. IPv6 is at the moment almost unlimited. Mind you that when I started working about 20 years ago, the same was said about IPv4. So, but I think if you look at the scale of IPv4, which assume that we compare it to golf ball, and IPv6, which can be compared to the sun, I think we should probably be good, at least for my lifetime. So, we have equipment, we have network. Your equipment, you can very easily identify what your IP address is, right? So you go to your properties of your network infrastructure, and there it will say what your IP address is. You can do the same thing for the information on the other side of the internet that you're trying to reach. And I used the example of the central website here. There is a very simple way to find that out. There are many ways, but this is probably the easiest one. Go to the command prompt in your Windows. Yes, it's still there. It looks very much like back to the 80s, but it's still there. And you use a command that is called nslookup, name server lookup. And then the website, the address of the site that you're trying to reach. And it will respond with 2 things. It will respond with an IPv6 address and an IPv4 address. We'll use the IPv4 address for the rest of this exercise. So we have these 2. We have my device, and we have the website. So how do they communicate? So first of all, the thing that I didn't mention when I was talking about that infrastructure and the network and the Wi-Fi is if the story would stop there, then you would only be able to communicate with the other customers of the same ISP. If in Belgium you're a Belgacom customer, the former incumbent, you could talk to probably half of the Belgians on your network, and that would be it. There would be no reach to the rest of the internet. But this is what the internet looks like from probably standing on the moon. These are all the networks and how they're connected to each other. This picture dates from October last year. So what you see is that there are millions of connections. It probably looks pretty much like the synaptic connections in a brain. Some of these are much bigger crossroads than others. And these are the internet exchanges. They're crucial. They make networks talk much more efficiently to each other. In Belgium, we have BNIX. It's located about a kilometer from here, although now they have 3 sites, I heard. And it's a place where literally you have all the ISPs and the telecom operators with their cupboards against the walls, and across the room there are the connections between the networks. So Belgacom, with all its customers, brings in a cable, and from there it can peer. That is the term called for connecting with the other networks. There is no financial transaction involved, by the way. It can peer with the other networks. The peering is an important principle because it means that operators joining, connecting to the internet are okay to get traffic from other networks and hand it over. So there is no financial transaction involved. And it's very easy to find an example that shows differently. That's mobile connectivity. I mean, if you're with your mobile, you're roaming, then there is financial transactions when you're crossing borders. For the internet, there isn't. And without it, it probably wouldn't work as efficiently as it did. So key facilities, these internet exchanges. This is a picture from DIGIX, the internet exchange in Germany in Frankfurt. The best thing is that it's actually possible to see how traffic hops around the internet. Everybody can do it on their own laptop. And it's by using the traceroute command. It's trace RT. And I worked in the office on a quick demo. So if you do a trace RT for the center website, then you're actually asking your machine, how am I connecting from my machine to the machine, wherever that is, where that website is on? So it starts again with identifying where that machine, the content that you're trying to reach is, the center website. And then the hopping starts. Here we're still in the office. The IP address of my machine, it's the IP address of our firewall. And this is the Belgacom box in our entrance hall. From there, again, the cables parallel with the elevator shaft to the street, the gray box that we mentioned in the picture overview there. This probably somewhere near Square Urbain, where Belgacom's area hub is for our office area. Another Belgacom hub on their network. And then you end up already at the Telenet server, which is another network, a competing operator in Belgium. And you can even see where it is. It's in Benix. It's the exchange that I mentioned earlier, that crucial point where networks hand over their traffic to each other. So from then on, we're on a Telenet network, and we keep on hopping to eventually reach the destination, which is an Open Minds network. Open Minds is the provider, or host where the center website is located. So, but the nice thing is that one can visualize, and you can do this exercise, by the way, for content that is across the globe, and you'll be hopping from Europe to the US and then to South America and eventually end up on the website of an Argentinian newspaper. So, but you can actually visualize how it works. Importantly, do this exercise twice within seconds, and very likely you'll see differences because it is unpredictable where the traffic goes. There is no set route. It will use the route that at that moment is the most efficient, the quickest, where there is no delays reported. So we have our equipment, we have the network, we have IP addresses. We've seen how traffic hops along. We're gradually getting to the point where I'm going to explain what blocking is. But first, we need to add one more layer, and that's the DNS. So why do we need DNS? How does it work? What the root is and what is the top-level domain? So why do we need DNS? And I appreciate that this probably does not make sense, and I'm sure you can't read the white. These are IP addresses. These are the destinations that we're trying to reach. None of these addresses should mean anything to any one of you, and if it does, then I would be a bit worried. But these are strings of numbers. Nobody will memorize them. All of them are the most popular websites in some European countries and Europe. Importantly, they can also be the IP addresses of mail servers. So if you send an email, you're also sending content to particular IP address, the IP address of that machine that hosts the mail server. You wouldn't want to remember all those addresses, so you have... That's Poland, Allegro. Oh. All right, so there is somebody in the audience who can read IP addresses. It is indeed. But the majority of this room probably thinks that DNS is very useful to remember destinations on the web. So remembering the address is probably the prime reason. There is another one, and it's flexibility. So I showed the pictures of the data centers. Those data centers have an IP address. Sometimes some things happen. Electricity is cut off, there's a fire, the disk crashes on which the information is sitting. You want, as an information provider, you want to be able to switch immediately to your backup. If it wouldn't be for the DNS, what you would have to do is to tell your millions of customers, my IP address changed from whatever to something else. That wouldn't scale. So with the DNS, you don't have to tell your customers anything. Your customers even won't notice. Your customers will still use the address that you've provided them with or that they know. And the underlying IP address is changed without a glitch. So flexibility is a really important reason. Security is also one. It makes the network more stable. It allows to do some traffic management. And there are tools in addition to DNS, such as Anycast. It goes a bit too much in detail to explain that now, but that would allow providers to divert DDoS attacks, or at least to mitigate the impact. Also, a fourth reason, I think in every single room at EuroDIG, at least one person will mention the Internet of Things. One of the problems with the Internet of Things is that at the moment there is no strong agreement on the standards that are going to be used. One of the standards that's already there, that's already been tested for 3 decades, a bit more, is the DNS. The DNS could provide the basis to operate some of the Internet of Things applications. I'm going to give you a quick example. Wrong button. So Nominet, our UK member running .uk amongst a couple of others, has a fabulous R&D department. And one of the things they do is they play around a lot with high-tech stuff. And sometimes that high-tech stuff starts very basic. It starts with the idea that there is a lot of connectivity that's no longer being used, and that's the white space. And the white space is the wavelengths that were used by the broadcasters, the television broadcasters. So that antennae probably makes you think back of 70s, 80s, maybe some early 90s. But that space is available. In the UK, it is not commercialized, it is not sold, it's not licensed, but people can use it for R&D purposes. So Nominet started thinking of what can they do with that space. And one of the things they did was they connected devices. These are very simple sensors with very basic equipment. All right, this is a router that connects this thing. Well, actually, it's here too. And broadcasts the signal. It's stuck in this device is stuck in a waterproof housing because they put it under bridges. And once stuck under a bridge, the only thing it does is it measures the distance between itself and the water level. When the water level goes up, it's a signal that downstream in a couple of minutes, hours, depending on the situation from now, they will see more water flowing through that river. One of the big problems in the Oxford region is that there is traffic congestion because roads get flooded. With this very simple device, and obviously stuck under plenty of bridges, it becomes possible to predict flooding downstream. The data is shared in an open way, so it's open data. And people have already built, Nominet as well, have already built tools that help interpret the data and give drivers nice maps to allow them to drive around floodings in their area. So it's a very practical example. So where does the DNS fit in? Here. If you stick these devices under bridges and they have numbers, the moment something goes wrong, and I can assure you with a device stuck under a bridge, there are plenty of possibilities where things might go wrong, could get wet. You need backups. And so there is more than one device under a bridge. If one breaks down, they can switch to another one. They're using the DNS as a basis, as a reference point for these devices. And so as a user, the only thing you would be interested in is the name of the bridge, and you don't care about the IP address of the underlying device. Another one I heard, nothing to do with Nomanet, another one I heard yesterday or 2 days ago on the news was that people are now building in sensors in umbrellas. And these sensors, they capture the sound of the raindrops on your umbrella. And the rhythm of the raindrops is a good predictor of how much rain is falling in that very specific area. The signal is sent to your mobile phone. The mobile phone sends it to your weather forecast system or whatever system you're part of. The thing is that these sensors at the moment do one thing, but they could be doing much more. But because it's a closed system, the only information that is being used from that sensor is for that specific application. If you build open standards and you use DNS to support access to that device for other providers, you could also pick up sound pollution from a specific area with that same sound recording sensor and use it for different applications. So that is a fourth reason for the DNS. It's an open standard that is stable and secure and could provide a scalable solution for Internet of Things applications. How the DNS technically works, there's a really nice video by Center. Don't check the address, but if you go to YouTube and look for Center DNS, not Center, that's a hip-hop group from Moscow, but if you go for Center DNS, then you'll find it as one of the first hits there. So we understand why we need the DNS and what it does, but how does it work on a high level? What time is it? No. We have a root that is the place of all wisdom for everything that is below in the following layer. To explain it, when you're typing in a domain name, by the way, who knows about the hidden dot? 3, 4 people. When you're typing in an address, you're typing in www.center.org. What your browser understands you to actually asking is www.center.org. There is a final dot there. But your browser knows that you're lazy, so it adds it itself. You can try it. I mean, feel free to add the dot. It might confuse your browser for a millisecond or two, and then probably realize that you've been in a training or you're a techie. But the final dot says to your browser, look up this address in the root. And in the root, the information is kept that will tell your browser where the top-level domain files are hosted. So it's a hierarchical system where one level, the upper level, refers to the level below. The upper level has no idea of what's here, definitely not what's here. The root zone is maintained by IANA. IANA is at the moment a part of ICANN. It's currently under transition, as some of you might have heard, but is the maintainer of the root zone, so that top level. The second level, and I'm using the .eu example here, is run by a TLD registry, and in this case, for .eu, it's EuroDIG. EuroDIG is a not-for-profit organization, like most of the CCTLDs, by the way. It's a not-for-profit organization that has been appointed by the Commission and just got renewed for, I think, another 10 years. It's also our host. The domain itself, so europa.eu, is run by the domain admin from the Commission. So none of these have anything to do with this. So it's a very important principle, and that will show later on. This is what the root looks like. It's probably the most disappointing picture from the slide deck. Let me tell you first that there are two things. There is the zone file, which is the thing your machine will read. And there is the zone database. When we're talking about when we're talking about human access to that type of information, people will typically consult the root zone database. There is no personal data in the root zone. There's no personal data in the zone file. you will find the names and contact information of the owner of a website in the root zone database. So the root zone has 13 identical copies, authoritative name servers. For redundancy reasons, they're run by different organizations. And 2 of these organizations are European. RIPE is running one, and NetNot. RIPE is in Amsterdam, NetNot in Sweden. Of those 13 copies, there are, of course, many more duplicates all around the world, thousands and thousands. 4 of these, for instance, are hosted in Brussels by telecom operators. At the moment, the US government, a department of the US government, oversees IANA. And you can imagine that IANA is pretty important since it is managing the root zone file. So what does that look like? This is what it looks like. So I already told you that with that final hidden dot, your laptop, phone, knows that it should ask the root, where can I find .eu? And this is what the root will answer. It will give you a list of name servers, and it will give you, with this list of name servers, a range of IP addresses where you will find the information for the next level. I told you about the levels, and you understood that the different levels only have information about the level below. So when I query the root, it will just tell me where can I find these .eu name servers. They hold identical information, but for redundancy reasons, there are many more. You'll see that some of them have an IPv6 address, others have an IPv4 address. Very briefly, the difference between CCTLDs and GTLDs. So if you look at the top level domain, the .eu example that I gave you is a country code. It's 2 letters, .eu, .nl, .uk, .es country codes. They're all part of a list. The people that came up, that developed the DNS, had a really good, smart ID to make sure that they did not get anywhere near deciding what was a country and what wasn't. So they used an United Nations organization, the ISO, International Standards Organizations, as a reference point. And so the list that the ISO came up with is the list that decides on what is a country, who gets a country code, and who doesn't. So in total, there are about 300 CCTLDs these days. The last 50 that have been added are the non-Latin scripts. It's Hangul for Korean, it's simplified Chinese, it's quite a few of the Indian languages. In addition, we have now probably just over 1,000 GTLDs. When I was drafting this presentation last week, the 1,000th GTLD was added to the zone last Tuesday. There might be 2 or 3 more by now. How do you get the GTLD? You apply at ICANN. It's a pretty costly process. It's about $200,000 to send an application. And the next round might be open up in a year or 2 from now. The biggest difference between CCTLDs and GTLDs is, as I already mentioned, CCTLDs are typically not-for-profit, but they serve a local internet community. So they're stuck with the policies that serve that community, and they're obviously respecting local laws, which will differ from .nl compared to .uk or .sk. GTLDs are under contract with ICANN, and you might have heard a lot about the privacy implications of that, but for instance, for the who-is access, there's some discrepancy between the requirements in that contract and European laws. So on the second level, and this is a copy of the, not the root zone file, but the database. So where we have the personal information of the registrant, in this case, for the domain europa.eu. Again, with the name servers for the email and for the websites and the alternative addresses in case for redundancy purposes. So now we're looking again at the practice. So we went through the theory. So hierarchical system on one level points to the next. So what happens when a user types in a domain? The querying starts. So your laptop is going to ask, where can I find an IP address for example.eu? your laptop is not going to ask it directly. It's going to ask a very powerful friend, that is your access provider's DNS resolver, to do the querying for you and then send you the answer. So the access provider is first going to query the root. Remember the hidden dot? So it's asking, where do I find .eu? The root is going to respond with an address that I just showed you on that list. And then the access provider is going to query the .eu servers. Where am I finding example.eu? That information is stored in that file. It is returned to the access provider's DNS resolvers. And then you can query example.eu for where www, their website, is based. You could also have asked, again, for their SMTP, which is their mail server. Only then you get a response back that will be able to identify the location where the content is actually hosted. So this is in 8 steps how the DNS works. The querying happens step by step. You get a response, and then with that response you can access the content. Now that you know how it should work, let's look at DNS blocking. There are a couple of ways in which DNS blocking is imposed, typically through court orders, sometimes on a voluntary basis, but let's just assume that from a technical perspective we're looking at blocking that is commissioned, that is ordered by a court. So the court could tell your access provider, your ISP, if somebody asks for www.example.eu, don't answer him. So Belgacom, Telenet, the ISPs, access providers of this world, then have to respond, there is no such domain. So that's one way of blocking. It's important to realize that this type of blocking will only affect the customers of this ISP. Find another ISP that was not covered by the court order, and trust me, I've seen no court orders that were successful in covering all ISPs, and I'm talking about Belgian court orders. So there's a scalability problem with this one. There's another example where the court tells the ISP, don't ignore or don't tell the user that you don't know where it is, but give them a fake answer. So the user wants to access example.eu, the ISP says, sure, it's that way. And they point to a server hosted by the law enforcement. On that server, and if you go to piratebay.se in Belgium, so probably from this room, you will get this. So that is information hosted on a server by local law enforcement. And it's a bit a sidestep, but I want to read something to you because you can't. So the information that you receive there is obviously it's blocking you from accessing the content that you want, but then you have been redirected to this stop page because the website you are trying to visit offers content that is considered illegal according to Belgian legislation. That's, all good for now. But then, if you are the owner or administrator of this website and you consider to be wrongly redirected, you can report this by fax and then a telephone number. So I think it's a really clever way to make sure that they don't get too much complaints about that.
Well, actually, Peter, they're really smart because they have blocked your domain. You will not be able to receive the responding email. So using fax is actually they are smarter than they know themselves.
All right, so that takes away a bit the fun of the joke, but you're absolutely right. But it would have been nice to have at least a couple of alternatives. But so this is a stop page, but it's a good point, Peter, thanks. This is a stop page you would get when your ISP is supposed to lie to you. There's a third way on how blocking is implemented, and that is not the ISP, but the registry.eu gets a court order. And the court order tells the registry to pretend that it never heard of that name in its zone file. So these are the three most, there are a couple of others, but these are the most commonly used blocking mechanisms in court orders today.
In this case, all the ISPs will be
Yes, indeed. But there are a couple of technical flaws in blocking. Before even going to the technical flaws, it is crucial to understand that regardless of whether it is blocked on an ISP level or on a registry level, the content is still there. The content doesn't disappear. And as I'm going to show you, there are plenty of ways that even without becoming or crossing the thin lines with illegality, you can still easily access the content. So the most easy one, which the Pirate Bay has been very successful in the last 2-3 years, is just make minor changes to your domain name. The Pirate Bay changed to the French Bay des Pirates. It changed to the Dutch Piratenbaai. It had a site which was called the Hydra, and the idea was that cut one head off and another will grow. So that is the simplest way for content owners who still want to make sure that their content gets online to make sure it does. And the time it takes to get a new blocking order probably makes it a very inefficient method. So you just ask for the IP address of a copy of that website, and you're going to get access to the content. The other technical flaw, which you understood from the whole traceroute thing that I showed, it doesn't always work, but most important content will be hosted on a dedicated site, so it will have its specific IP address. So you type in the IP address in your browser. And rather than doing the lookup, the NS lookup, and then the querying, you immediately get access to the content because you know where to look for it. Many companies run their own DNS server, so they don't use this one. They have their own. And a really fun example was when I was asked to give a training at the Commission and do an example of blocking there. I had to circumvent the major problem that the Commission didn't block anything that was requested in Belgian court orders. So within the buildings of the Commission, it was impossible to find an example of blocking and then to show them that I could circumvent it. So we VPN'd out to the center office, so to be back in the real world, and then from there we went outside. So yes, the DNS resolver will not be subject by the court order, and you'll just get the same querying 3 levels and eventually ending up with access to the content. You can use third parties, so don't use your access providers. You are not a company, you don't have your own. Then you can simply use, for instance, Google's. Everybody can remember it. It's actually, we didn't use this example, but you can change this to 8.8.8.8. And you will not be affected by any of the blocking restrictions in your jurisdiction. Okay, so that basically just explained what I already did. Web proxies is, I think, a 4th or a 5th by now, alternative to getting access to content without being affected by these court orders. You can go to a proxy website. It will be hosted outside your jurisdiction. There you type in the name of the information that you want to reach, and the proxy website will get it for you. That will be completely unaffected by the blocking order. So the proxy server, it's sometimes a service that you will pay for, but you will also find them for free because they like to sniff your traffic. So I wouldn't personally advise to use them. But a proxy server will help you in getting information from somewhere else on the internet without identifying yourself. That's what most people use them for. But it also, as a side effect of that, it bypasses DNS blocking. I'm not even going to go into these because they're quite technical to understand how they work, but if you have heard about Tor or OneSwarm, there are other alternatives that probably mean for many users that blocking is completely ineffective. So what are the conclusions? DNS blocking is a technical term. It's a procedure. It's not an outcome. Because the outcome is quite often that actually the information is not blocked at all, and it definitely is not going anywhere, so it's still there. The important thing, and if you take one thing away from this presentation, is on a technical level, it is almost impossible to prevent people from access content if they want to get there. But DNS blocking might indeed be efficient to make sure that nobody gets across something without them wanting to. Like, DNS blocking will prevent my dad from, by accident, stumbling across the Pirate Bay. It will not stop my 18, 19-year-old nephew from getting access to the Pirate Bay, because if the user wants to get to the content, he will. So that's a big difference. Time to wrap up. Internet is built with carrots. We talked about infrastructure, devices, how they're connected, and how you can see the hopping over the network. We explained why you need DNS and briefly how it works. So the hierarchical system, one layer is in charge of the information for the layer just below it. And we discussed how DNS works and how blocking works and how there are some technical flaws in blocking. It's important to note that some corners were cut during this presentation to fit it all in 40-ish minutes. Thanks to Malcolm Hutty, who couldn't have joined us, but I've used his fancy slides on the blocking, so thanks so much for that if he's online. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Peter. I think that was a great presentation, and let me add my thanks and kudos to Malcolm for visualizing all this very difficult to understand stuff. Do you have questions for Peter? And so now we would like to ask for non-policy related questions, but questions on the technical basics. You have one.
Kind of technical questions. In Italy, I'm Innocento Genero from the Italian ISP Association. In Italy is a country of web blocking. I think anyone can go to the court or to the regulator and say, yeah, I want to block this. And basically, there are two kinds of technology used, DNS blocking or IP blocking. The technical legal question is, I've been told that while IP blocking can be considered a real breach of the freedom of people, because really you block in a very effective way access to certain content, DNS blocking is not considered legally the same things, because the ISP is not really breaching the access to a point of the net, but it's just refraining to make a function, to make something. Do you have the same legal view on this?
In theory, this is true. I mean, these are two different things, and it is essential to see that most of these bypassing technologies that I've demonstrated very briefly for DNS are also applicable to IP access. The blocking will only work if you are as close as possible to one end of the information stream. So if it's between me and the central website, if you're almost blocking right when my internet access enters the Belgacom network, you will have a chance of actually blocking my access to that information. And the same if you would give Telenet or OpenMinds an order to block access to that particular IP address on their side. So only when you're on the extremes of the communication, the IP blocking will function and will be more effective than DNS blocking. But everything else that happens in between can be circumvented in similar ways.
Can you please use the microphone for the benefit of the remote participants?
So the explanation I got that technically in the DNS case, the ISP is not really preventing communication. It's just refraining from doing something. This is the legal explanation. So it's not doing, it's abstaining of doing. Okay. And this is why there is this legal discussion whether there is a breach of freedom of speech or not. So I just wanted to inform this theory.
Thank you so much. There's another question. Let me just walk through the room.
Just maybe quickly, Peter Jansen from the .eu registry, so EuroDIG. Maybe a comparison with a other real-world example will work here. DNS blocking is tearing up the yellow pages or the white pages, so you can't use the name to find the telephone number. IP blocking is making sure that if you type in the telephone number in your telephone, that it doesn't work. So there is a difference in practice how you do this. One prevents you from finding out the IP address, the telephone number, to make the call. The other one prevents you actually from making the call. So there is a difference in practice. What that translates to in legal, and as I'm lucky having a very techie hat on here, I'm not even going to want to go in there what legally is different there, but technically there is a huge difference between DNS blocking and IP address blocking. One indeed makes sure that you can't find the IP address, but if you know it, you can still make the phone call. The other one is, well, even if you know the phone number, you can't go there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just for all of us to take away, you can block IP addresses, you can block names, and you can even go to a greater level of granularity, going to subdomains, third-level domains, fourth-level domains, or to directories to the left and right of the URL. So it depends on how nuanced you want to establish your filtering or blocking. We have another question.
Yeah, and actually, sorry, I'm going to be greedy. I have two questions. Marco, RIPE NCC. First question, very technical one. Technologies like DNSSEC, etc. What's the influence of that on this strategy? Second question, totally not related, is you're very much focused on the access side of things, on the resolver side of things. What if people look at other elements of the DNS? In Peter's words, what if you talk to the printer of the yellow pages rather than ripping up the yellow pages?
So we have 3 questions. Peter, do you want to take all of them, or?
No, I'll take the second question. And Peter, maybe you can talk about the DNSSEC implications, because my answer would be it breaks, but I can't explain why. It breaks. Okay. So the answer to the first question is DNSSEC would be broken by the redirection. Yeah, Peter will expand on that. On the second question, what happens if you talk to the printer? I think it's almost a policy question. It's not a technical question. But that's the whole reason why there is such an enormous, long-lasting, detailed discussion on the stewardship of IANA. We want to make sure that now everybody seems to trust the US government, although Edward Snowden might have given some people different perspectives on that. But the US government has been doing a very good job in consistently applying a set of rules and running and overseeing IANA, who's maintaining that zone file. Now that it's transitioning, we want to make sure that the new people who will be overseeing it will do an equally good job. And so it will be a multi-stakeholder effort that is not dominated by any of those stakeholders. That is definitely, it's one of the specific requirements from the US government when handing over, that will not be dominated by any governments with potentially completely different moral views on content, for instance. So at the moment we've avoided the problem that the printer of the yellow pages would be subject to pressure from anyone. And we intend to keep it like that.
So, Peter wanted to expand on DNSSEC, and there's been mentioning of the IANA stewardship transition. I wish I knew more about that. So,
okay, my name is Peter Koch. I work for DINIG, the DE top-level domain registry. Just wanted to differentiate here. We've been talking about blocking, but there was the one stop page with the funny fax number there. DNSSEC is a security technology that is designed to prevent or at least make detectable tampering with the DNS data. So when you ask a question to the domain name system and you get a forged response, this will usually be suppressed when it comes to the user. And that was not designed with law enforcement or anybody else in mind, but that was an attack that was exploited on the internet and is just securing the protocol and enabling the protocol to be used for future applications like the Internet of Things and so on and so forth. However, the security measures there are intent agnostic. That means whether that's a law enforcement or an organized criminal changing the responses doesn't make a difference for the technology. It detects a change, no matter what the intent was. That means that any change of the responses that is applied by the ISP or by some other intermediary will look to the system like an attack, and it will act accordingly, which means it will drop the response, and that actually helps blocking in that particular case because you don't get the response and you can't connect. However, it will avoid these redirection things where somebody's setting up a honey trap or honey pot so that the police or any other interesting law enforcement or whatever, what other agency you might have in your country, hopefully not, that any other agency can actually connect or collect the interested parties. That won't work. But it doesn't really interfere with blocking because it suppresses the forged response with the effect that you can't connect to the website anyway. But it's not a helping technology either because, yeah, we'll come to that later. No, not really. It looks like it helps the blocking, but it definitely breaks this quote education part, and that's a good thing, of course.
Thanks, Peter. Any more questions?
Thank you. I'm Auke from the Dutch Youth. I've got a question. How do hotels, for instance, prevent people to use their, or no, okay, let's rephrase. How do hotels prevent users to get access to the internet before paying? How does it work? Do they block IP addresses or DNS or?
Want to take that?
That's in various non-standard ways. My name is Olaf Kolkman. I'm Chief Internet Technology Officer for the Internet Society. In various non-standard ways. In general, what they do is they work with a captive portal, which basically sends all the traffic off, often by DNS replacement, not always, but often it does. Tries to capture the traffic and redirect to a payment site, and then after that they open up the traffic streams. Not standardized, but it is a methodology for blocking and filtering, in fact. So yeah, that is true. While I have the microphone, may I make a small plug? There is a document called RFC number 707054, RFC 7754, Technical Considerations for Internet Service Blocking and Filtering. That's a rather technical document that describes what happens in terms of scope, granularity, efficiency, of IP level blocking, domain name blocking, HTML blocking, all the different types of blocking that happen in the internet. It's very technical, but if you want to know some of the technical background of how the internet, how things work on the internet, that might be a fairly comprehensive start for looking at it.
And if I'm not mistaken, you wrote that document.
I was one of the editors of the document. This is an IEB document, the Internet Architecture Board. That means I've written a few paragraphs, but it's a collaborative effort.
Thanks very much. But actually your question was an excellent one because it allows us to introduce another dimension of filtering and blocking to the discussion. What we've heard about are measures that are taken that are not controlled by the user. So basically the ISP or some other instance is doing something. But the hotel tries to protect its commercial interests by not allowing its visitors to use the internet for free. And so could parents for their children or companies for their staff. So actually you can do filtering and blocking on a user autonomous basis as the account holder. And that's different to filtering and blocking that is imposed on the user without the user being able to change the settings. So unless there are more questions from you with respect to the technology or the technical aspects that we've heard of so capably from Peter, I would like to give the floor to the fire starters. And first fire starter is going to be Gregory Monnier. Where is he in the room? Gregory, I'm sorry, so close. He is head of outreach for Europol, and you're the first to speak. So start the fire.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, the Center, Nina and Peter, for inviting me, and all of you. So I'm working for Europol, which is the European law enforcement agency. It's based in The Hague, in the Netherlands, and we help national investigators, criminal investigators, the police, all the law enforcement authorities in Europe to connect their investigations. So basically, we've got a number of criminal databases back in our headquarters. We have a number of criminal analysts as well, covering every field, cybercrime, drug trafficking, terrorism, etc. Economic crime as well. And we get information from the national investigations. We run our database, we work with our analysts, and then we try to connect the dots. And once there are similarities, or once we find out that the Dutch police is working on the same target than the German BKA, for instance, then we will invite the investigators around a table, and then we ask them to open their cases, and we try to run a transnational investigation. So that's the core business we have. Now, we're talking about blocking. Yes, indeed, law enforcement is using various blocking techniques that Peter very eloquently explained. Basically, we use the DNS blocking and the ISP blocking, depending on the type of crime, and we use those techniques for two different types of crime in general. The first one is child sex exploitation, and then in that case, we usually work with ISPs. And then for intellectual property violations, then we work usually with the registries. What I want to make clear from the beginning, cops are not super smart, they're actually pretty dumb, but they know that the techniques of blockings are not super efficient. We know about it, of course. Our main task, and that society has been given the task to, and government is to protect the citizens, to go after criminals and try to keep society safe. When you take the example of child sexual exploitation, and that's probably the easiest one because there is a broad global consensus that this type of material should not be accessible by everyone because this is a crime, and there's no big discussion about it. Then in that case, you wonder why, if it is illegal, if it's prescribed by domestic legislation that this material is illegal, why should it be accessible freely to everyone? So that's one question. What I wanted to say also is that our main aim, we are investigators, we cops, we're not into censorship. We are going after criminals. That's our main goal. We try to investigate, we try to attribute crime and individuals that are behind, and that's very difficult online, as you know. And so blocking, and we don't really like the word blocking because we know about its limitations, we call limitation of access, rather, is just a mitigation activity that we do. If you can go after somebody who's producing child abuse material, and then you prevent that person from posting it online and trading it online, then you don't really need to block any website because your website wouldn't be there. So really our first objective is to get the guy. But then, of course, once the material is online, then it is our duty to prevent that everyone has access to it. And you might disagree with that. That's a compromise that society has made. This is our job. We know that there are technical limitations. We know, of course, that when we ask a registry to block the access to specific domain names, it's very easy to register a similar domain or to use a CCTLD, and then of course the impact of that measure is very limited. The same applies with ISPs, of course. You will have always ISPs that are based in jurisdictions that are not compliant, or they just don't care about, what the French police might be telling them, if they're in a country which is not compliant. So in conclusion, really, we're stupid, but we know about the limitation of the system. On the other hand, society has given us a task. We're trying to do it as best as we can, and we are asking you, the big brain, the techies, those who really know how internet works, and I mean, Peter, that's my question to you. How can we, as a society, ensure that content such as child abuse material is not accessible to anyone? Of course, and I agree with you, if you really want to have access, you will always have access. But I think it makes sense that the largest part of society doesn't have access freely to this type of illegal material. Thank you.
Thanks so much. If you permit, I have one follow-up question. You mentioned in a half sentence that you're going to the registry when it comes to intellectual property violations, and you would go to the ISPs when it comes to CSAM. Can you elaborate a little bit on why you make that distinction?
I knew you would be asking that question. While I was preparing and speaking to my colleagues, because I mean I'm not an investigator myself, but I work with them all the time. And to prepare this talk, I went to see them and to speak. I think one of the main reasons is that for to work with the registries and to request to block a domain names requires a heavier legal procedure. So in most countries you would probably need a court order. Whereas when you go to an ISPs, depending on the type of information you will be asking, then sometimes, and in some countries, ISPs are happy to, for very obvious illegal content to play ball, basically. I think that's one of the main reasons. So speed, if you gather a list of URLs and you send that list to an ISP, then they might just remove it, whereas for a registry, it might take a bit longer. And that's why, in fact, the US, and that's ICE, the agency that is leading, and we're working with them on a number of operations. One of them is in our site, and we do it every year. And very recently, I think it was last week, they had they blocked about 1,000 websites that were distributing copyrighted materials, stuff like fake medicine and everything. And they've got very good relationship with VeriSign, for instance. So it's easier to remove domains on .com, for instance. I know it's not really answering your questions, but with my limited knowledge on this, I'm trying to get there.
Thanks so much. Let's move to the next fire starter. Where's Marianne Fernandez? Advocacy Manager with EDRI, and you're going to be the next to start the fire.
Hi, thank you very much. So I'm Marianne. I work for European Digital Rights. So our job is to ensure that there's no censorship, for example, and to actually ensure that there's a protection of the rights to privacy, personal data, and also freedom of expression and any other rights, including net neutrality. So as a fire starter, I would disagree on certain aspects of what the previous fire starter said, but I would focus on what I had prepared. So the first point I would say is that blocking without a legal basis, thankfully to the regulation that was adopted last year on open access, is and should be prohibited. We see a trend currently that instead of asking for court orders, there's a trend for voluntary blocking that is not predictable, that does not respect the principle of necessity, of proportionality, of legal predictability, of the fact that we need review mechanisms, transparency mechanisms in place, as an assessment of any counterproductive effects that these measures would be taken are not being in place. So this is the first point. Voluntary blocking should be illegal, and we definitely would discourage that practice. Then I would also plead that we should not think about as a solution that one-fits-all solution is the solution. I don't know if I explained myself correctly. I refrain. So we have different public policy problems, right? So one of them is to combat child abuse. Another problem is to combat terrorism, copyright infringements, and many other public policy objectives. However, that doesn't mean that we need to take the same solution for all types of public policy objectives. And what we see in EDRI is that there's currently, from a state and government perspective, there's a push for companies to do more, and then there's a push for them to actually take responsibility, take the lead to actually block or remove content that might be legal or not, because the assessment is not being done according to the law, but according to the terms of service. And then for us, this in clear breach of the Charter of Fundamental Rights and also any other human rights obligations, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example. So, and then as an example of this breach, I would highlight the regulation on Europol that was recently adopted, which says that, for example, Europol should support member states' action in identifying crimes and actually making internet referrals to these online service providers. However, these online service providers would actually voluntarily consider what to do with these referrals. And then the authorities do not commit to actually assess these referrals on the basis of the law, but on the basis also of the terms of service. So we see a big problem with regards to the rule of law with the democratic society that we have and all the laws and case law that we have seen. And I think that's it for the fire starter.
Thanks so much. Next is Peter Koch. You've already heard Peter. Peter is with EuroDIG and he's Senior Policy Advisor with that CCTLD registry. Over to you.
Thank you. I guess most of the sparks I had prepared have now vanished already or used, which is good. So we can go to the broader discussion. I'd like to highlight some of the points here that we probably want to look at in the upcoming discussion. It's very important to distinguish between content that the user is explicitly seeking to access versus content, or I could say software, unwanted content in contrast to illegal content. So there are some advocates of DNS blocking or filtering for mitigating malware, for example. That happens very close to the user, and that already somebody mentioned. Anything that is happening at the edges is probably deemed a success, but it has a certain granularity and a certain scope. And the closer it is to the user, and in cases where the user is consenting to that measure, I guess these are the cases we do not need to talk about. We're talking about the unconsenting user being blocked from access. That's the one point, the position of the user and the intent or their desire to get to the content. Everybody's happy being blocked from viruses, unless you are a virus investigator. So even in that case, there are some corner cases that you might want to think about. To the scope and extent and the granularity, that's an important point that I guess Olaf mentioned when he was referring to that RFC. Doing things on a domain name level is not really granular. It's like wiping out a complete village from the map because you know there are some shady areas there and you want to protect people from going there. It doesn't help, but it also prevents people from going to the nice, whatever, museum or fountain in the middle of the village. So the granularity is missing at the DNS level, definitely. You have a URL usually that is maybe www, maybe something else, .domain name, .top level domain / Not all of the content is necessarily bad. By avoiding the translation of the domain name, you're preventing anything that is behind that translation from being accessed. And that's, of course, something to weigh in on. Let me see. Yeah. As a top-level domain registry, we are on the far side of what Peter had on his slide on the right side. We would usually not talk about blocking. Blocking is something that can happen at the access side. We are sometimes approached to take down domains, right? So because there's something bad behind that domain. Now, there's nothing bad behind that domain because the domain is just a string that is translated into an IP address or into some other identifier. We've already learned that could be a mail server. It could be something in the Internet of Things. So I get extra bonus for mentioning the Internet of Things twice now. Or something completely different. We shouldn't, well, the web is dead. We should think further ahead. There's much, much more than a single website behind the domain name. Domain names actually work as identities or can provide identities because you have your mail address behind them, you have your web server still there, you have your phone system behind them, and maybe you have all of your smart home stuff behind your own domain name. Now imagine your domain name is taken down. Oh, yeah, okay. Your problem if you engage in criminal things. Think so? Well, a domain translate into multiple IP addresses. You can have multiple names under them, and all of a sudden one of your web servers is compromised. Somebody's placing bad content on there, and next comes somebody saying to the registry, take down that domain because there's some bad content under some translation of that domain name. Okay, so we launched that rocket grenade into that 15-story building, and of course the sniper is gone, but unfortunately the 60 people in the building are also gone. So collateral damage is a significant risk here, and I haven't seen that being addressed to the extent I'd like to in those discussions. And the rest, I guess, we already covered. So, time for the fire extinguishers.
Thanks very much, Peter. And our last fire starter is over there. That's Lawrence Sari from the University of Luxembourg.
Hello.
There you go.
I take a different approach because we've seen how blocking affects the governmental and the police, how that they do that, how they take the technical and put into force what governmental policies that we've all agreed on, especially with child abuse images. My research kind of takes a different approach, which I think is equally fundamental and possibly more dangerous to a certain extent, and that is self-censorship on the internet. And in particular, I'm looking at some cases that are coming up. One of them is actually a case, and the other one is an example that just comes from today's use of Facebook. And I will pick on Facebook because that's what we all know and use and probably is up right now as we speak. The first case, and what they come out of is when we have the governmental regulation, and we also have self-regulation, but then we also have a layer of fear, that I would say, and that is the fear that we don't want to offend. So we will remove content that offends our sensibilities, our standards within the community. And in particular, this, for me, poses a problem or a danger because the discussion within these digital town squares becomes more limited. The recent case from the Côte d'Appel in Paris, and I don't know if anyone heard about it, but it was a posting of a professor posted a picture from the Orsay, of a painting from the Orsay, and it was L'Origine du Monde. And it's from 1866. It's a painting of a vagina. And it's been a controversial painting throughout its existence, but what Facebook's response was has nothing to do with blocking. What they did was they closed his account. He sued. He sued in Paris. And this is where it becomes relevant, I think, is because the liability for those platforms was always governed, if they were American or if they were from California, by the terms and conditions that come out of the Northern District, or I think it's the Northern District of California. So you'd have to go to California to sue. I don't know, I'm in Luxembourg. I'd love to go to California, but I doubt I'd do it because they closed my Facebook account. However, what the court just held on the 5th of March is that that clause within the terms and conditions is an abusive clause. Particularly abusive because it effectively shut down this individual's right to redress in the courts. There's no jurisdiction in the court in Paris, therefore there's no remedy. And what the court in Paris said, not so fast. That's an abusive clause, and for the purpose of jurisdiction, we haven't even gotten to the merits of the case. For the purposes of jurisdiction, the case can go forward in Paris. I think that's significant because the conundrum for places like Facebook or Snapchat or any of the social networks is that they're global and they have to comply with the individual national laws or EU legislation or American legislation. So they are trying to water down what is acceptable in order to not piss off anybody. And I think that that's dangerous. It's dangerous for a number of reasons. Ms. Fernandez mentioned that when you have regulations that they have to be transparent and they have to be with certain aspects of fair process. And that seems to be what's missing from a more surface analysis. In other words, for the user who is posting or the user is opening an account. but I think it's also very important for two reasons. First of all, because it directly affects the freedom of expression, especially in countries where you have a private right to challenge a private company on the issue of freedom of expression, or the right to privacy. It's applicable horizontally, I think. Secondly, it's dangerous for the companies themselves, because as it is less transparent, and as these clauses perhaps are truly abusive in that they limit the right or redress of the user themselves, they will not be honored, particularly in places like France or in the European Union and the member states. So that's I wasn't sure if it was fire starting or bedwetting. So you can be the judge, but to throw it out, is that the freedom of expression can be challenged at a more scientific or a more technical place, definitely. But it also, when you open up your smartphone and check your Facebook page, it's also being challenged there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid our time is already eaten up, so we're going into your coffee break, if I'm not mistaken. Nonetheless, I would like to take one or two questions or comments from the floor, and then we're going to wrap up. So Oliver is going to go first, and then Alex.
Thanks, Thomas. Hi, everyone. I'm Oliver Sume, president of EuroISPA, so one of the co-hosts of this workshop here today. And just one comment to EuroISPA before I come to what I wanted to say. EuroISPA is the European ISP association. We are representing currently more than 2,500 ISPs from all over Europe and the EFTA countries. And we are very happy to co-host this workshop here with Center today. And what I wanted to say was one reply or addition to what Gregory said about blocking and child pornography or child abuse. Unfortunately, child abuse or child misuse is one of the most common justification for blocking. And I think there are some things that I'd like to add to what you said. Everybody will agree that nobody wants to have access to such kind of content. But I think the social responsibility is far more than blocking access. I think the first responsibility is to avoid such content being on the web. And the most important thing to know about blocking is, and that came up very clear after this presentation here, is blocking is nothing else than putting a curtain about something that you don't see anymore, which doesn't change anything that it's still existing. And not only the pictures and the movies or whatever in terms of child misuse are existing, even worse is that the crimes are happening. So what we see here on the internet is unfortunately only the peak of an iceberg about something really disgusting that's happening in the middle of our society. The discussion about blocking, in particular when you talk about blocking of child abuse material, to my experience, very often leads away from the main problem, which is the source on the internet. And we should not, regardless on how you stand for blocking and what your opinion about blocking and filtering is, the first and foremost, the challenge is to remove the content from the internet. And that is something that is happening very successful in many cases. You may know that many ISPs are operating hotlines where people can notify such content, and the hotlines are also cooperating with many law enforcement agencies all over Europe, not only to follow the crime, but to delete these content at the source. And this is a very successful system. So successful that in Germany, where I come from, we are not blocking child pornography anymore, because we experienced that these hotlines are working so fast that on an international level we can take down the content within some hours, at the latest within 24 hours, which is far more effective than any blocking measure you would try to start. So even if you discuss blocking and filtering measures in terms of child pornography and child misuse, let's not forget the main purpose and the main action, which should be to take down the content. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Oliver. Just wait for the microphone for the remote participants.
Thank you very much. Enlighten me very quickly. What's the difference between the police sending a URL to an ISP to ask, we say blocking, we would like to see removal, and most of the time it's removal, and what you were saying, hotlines and police does exactly the same way. We are for removal, definitely. We're not for blocking at all. That's much more efficient. So on that, we completely, and again, blocking and removal, that's only a mitigation factor. We want to prevent that crime from happening at all.
Thanks very much. Last intervention from the UK.
Hello, my name is Nick Shorey. I'm from the UK government. I'm just going to sort of throw an idea and a question out here at the same time, following something that has been mentioned to me previously on a similar topic. So continuing this, the child sexual exploitation theme, let's say there is some CSE content that is hosted online on a web server that's hidden behind sort of a layer of proxies. So basically, you can't identify the location of the server, or it's in a location that's very difficult to take down. A domain name is used to resolve to that content, and it's for example, it could be like childseximageshare.eu. Okay. Law enforcement attempt to take down that domain, and they're successful. But then, as we've heard, the people behind this register a new domain name, childseximageshare.net, and it's this case of whack-a-mole. Now, I absolutely agree that the priority has got to be to try and find a way to locate that content and take that down. That is the best action, the best solution. But that domain name is kind of it's advertising potentially that sort of service, that type of content maybe. So my question is: do registrars or registries already proactively restrict registration of such explicit sort of URL strings or domain names there? If not, should this be something to consider doing? So rather than sort of, we've been talking about blocking, and it kind of seems to me when we want to try and sort of block domain names, it's kind of like an after the fact sort of thing. That domain name already exists. So my sort of question is phrased around: should we are we sort of taking a proactive approach to maybe stop explicit strings being entered into the DNS already, or should this be something that we should consider doing? To whoever fancies answering.
Thanks very much. I'm afraid that there are more hands going up. I mean, this is eating into your coffee break. Just 2 sentences, okay? And then I go to Peter to wrap up.
So again, Peter Janssen, techie from .eu. Childpornography.eu, you would not want that domain name to exist, I presume. But what about the Anti-Child Pornography Association.eu? You have a problem that if you do on a substring that you actually carve out all the rest again as well. So that is a very difficult thing to do in an automated way. That would mean everybody would have to do a conscious evaluation of what the domain name is actually used for. And then we're talking about content again. And then again, the bad boys don't always use obvious names like that, but they might, nicepictures.eu or something like that. So it's not that easy. I agree with you, but it's not that easy.
Thanks very much. I think we could continue for hours and hours, but I suggest that you continue the conversation over a coffee. Peter, quick wrap up before I close the session.
Oh, well, it's an answer to Nick's question. So it does happen that there is a blacklist of names that will not be used in a zone file. So they will be stopped upon registration. But that blacklist is typically ordered through court order, or it is part of a law. For instance, some financial laws in one of the Nordic countries, I don't know if there are any Swedes in this room, but I seem to remember that the Swedish government has imposed some restrictions on the use of the word bank in a name. But you do not want, I think, a private entity to start up making rules of what is allowed and what is not allowed. But if these blacklists have a legal background, then I think you already see some of those examples in practice. I think from a technical perspective and from an organizational perspective, it is highly disputable whether this is scalable. If you have 100, if you have 1,000, if you have 3,000, it's fine. The moment you run into hundreds of thousands of names, it would probably become a bit problematic.
Thanks very much, Peter. I guess this has been an excellent starting point for a discussion that hopefully you're going to continue over coffee and when you go home and talk to your peers in your respective communities. I think what we should take away from this conversation is that there are different technical methods to do filtering and blocking. There are different impacts that these measures have. There are different collateral damages there might be depending on what you deploy. And then there are a lot of policy questions surrounding it. For what type of content or services do you want to see filtering or do you not want to see filtering? Who does it? Is it the ISP having acceptable use policies where he does not allow his customers to do certain things? Or is it law enforcement authorities? Or is it any other third party that might want to impose blocking or filtering? Then, once you've deployed those technologies, and I think this is something that we haven't yet discussed, if you install something, a technical infrastructure that allows for blocking and filtering with the best intentions, this infrastructure can be used for other measures. So we need to carefully discuss what transparency should be applied when it comes to those filtering technologies. I know of cases where URLs and IP addresses are added and added and added to a filtering list, and nobody looks whether the name still exists or whether these entries should still be there. So there are a lot of implications. I think that we're all on the same page when it comes to protecting children from abuse. But let's not forget, behind a lot of those images, there is real abuse, potentially ongoing abuse. So I couldn't agree more with Gregory that the first call for action should be to find the perpetrators and prosecute them. And when it comes to filtering and blocking, this should be very carefully considered for all the implications that we've discussed today. I think what's encouraging is to see all the feedback from you. It's great that we have such great attendance. Again, let's continue the conversation at a later stage. Thanks to Peter for the introductory presentation and also to Malcolm. And thanks to the Firestarters. Have a great day. Thank you very much.